happy. He was invited to join for dinner, and he did. And that night, they had a wonderful time. The man didn't hear an ounce of complaining and said he heard only praises about him and how wonderful he was. And all the sparrows took turns dancing for his enjoyment, and he had the place of honor at the table, and he was given the best of the food. The sparrows even tried to get him to stay longer, but he said, "I'm sorry, Lady Sparrow, I can't stay. My wife is surely waiting." "But your wife will just complain. She'll continue to nag." "I know. But she's my wife, and I must get home before she's worried." Well, the Lady Sparrow was so impressed with her former master that she called for their servants to bring 2 boxes. One was a very large lacquer box, the second one smaller. And she said, "Please, master, take your pick of these boxes." And he said, "Well, since I'm very old, I will take the smaller. I know it will be much easier to carry. Thank you very much." Well, that night, he took the box, attached it to his back, and began to walk home. When we got there, of course, his wife had very interesting things to say, and she began to throw things around the house. And as she was doing this, the old man took the box off his back, put it down on the ground, and said, "Lady Sparrow gave me this." Well, she very readily opened it up, and they were very pleased to find that there were gems and gold and all kinds of wondrous treasures inside. What happened, though, was that, other than being pleased, the wife began to chide her husband and yell at him because if he had chosen the larger box, they'd be even wealthier. He wouldn't have to work in his, well, he didn't have children, but she wouldn't have to work. And he began to apologize, and he began to wish that he had never, ever mentioned the second box. The wife, however, was very greedy, and she wouldn't let it drop. So the next day, she decided she was going to go see the sparrow, and the husband pleaded and begged her to not do it. After all, she had been so cruel to the bird. But she struck out anyway, and she began to call, "Where's the tongue-cut sparrow? Where's the tongue-cut sparrow?" And finally, she was able to find the place that was described. And even though Lady Sparrow had been very mistreated by the woman, she remembered at one point she had been her mistress. So very dutifully, she went out and she presented herself and said, "Hello, mistress." And then, rather than being grateful for being presented with such a person, the woman was rude. She said, "I don't need the elegance, I don't need the dinner, just bring me the box that my husband left and I'll be on my way." Well, Lady Sparrow was very drawn back by this. It was very rude of the woman to come along even after cutting off her tongue and then to demand something, but she called for it. What the woman had not counted on, however, was the sparrow's family being very upset with her for what she'd done. And the sparrow's pain, she never once considered it in her greed. So, the box was brought out by the servants. The woman picked it up and carried it home. However, she was old and it was very heavy, so she had to keep stopping as she was going, and finally, whenever she stopped, she began very curiously. And finally, she put the box down and she opened the lid. Even as she opened it, she began to see all kinds of demons begin to crawl out of it. One in particular with just one eye that began to reach for her through the box. Well, running away, she couldn't believe it, and then as she began to run, they began to pursue. But eventually, she was able to get away from them, as old as she was. When she got home, she could barely tell her husband what had happened. And finally, after that, she began to change. The man found that as the days passed, the woman became far more pleasant than she had been in years. And finally, in a year's time, the woman was a completely different person. She was very kind to her husband, never said a cruel word, and was the ideal wife. What's the moral of this story?
Don't be greedy.
Don't be greedy?
Don't be an ass.
Am I allowed to say that? You guys are panel staff, you tell me. Okay, don't be an ass.
We're all adults here.
Maybe. I'm not sure I count most of the time.
I'm not seeing any children.
Maybe have children on occasion. I will say no to that one. But really, be kind. Don't be unworthy. And don't be a shrew. The woman could have easily been a much better person, but she chose not to be. Next up, we have the bamboo cutter and the princess. Now, who knows the story of the bamboo cutter and the princess? No one? Oh my gosh, I'm the only dork here. Okay. Once there was an old man, because as you will notice in Japanese fairy tales, old men are very popular. Once there was an old man in his life. Now, he had worked as a woodcutter all his life, but him and his wife had never had a child. And because of this, the man knew he would have to work until he died because he could never have an heir. So every day he would dutifully go out. he would cut the bamboo, and he would cut it crosswise, or he would cut it in sections, carry it home, and there him and his wife would make it into household tools to sell. And the man continued with this every day of his life. So much so that as he began to grow more tired, he began to worry because he knew eventually he would die, and he did not know who would care for his wife. Well, as he went out one day, he had his hatchet with him, and he walked up the mountains. He kept going through bamboo grove to bamboo grove, cutting it down. And even as he was doing this, he began to see a glow off in the distance. Growing curious, he left his bamboo on the side, and he began to walk towards it. And he found eventually that the glow was coming from a specific stalk of bamboo. As he began to look, though, he saw something interesting, and he put down his hatchet and went over and looked. And inside the bamboo stalk, whenever he bent it down, there was a little 3-inch girl. And he took her into his hands and he said, "You're so beautiful. You were surely sent by the gods to be my daughter." So he left everything that he had there, and he took the little girl home and he presented her to his wife. And he said, "Finally, the gods have blessed us with a daughter," and she was pleased as well, and together they began a little family. They were all very protective of the little girl. In fact, the woman always kept her in a little basket to keep her safe from everything else. And the man, as he went about his work and he began chopping down bamboo, he began to find gold and rubies and everything else. And soon he was no longer known as the poor woodcutter, but rather a very wealthy man. Well, as all this began happening, the little girl actually grew into a full-size girl at the age of 3 months. So she was finally the right size, and she continued to grow normally through that. And finally the day came to actually name the girl. So the family called for a famous name giver, who looked at the girl and seeing her glowing light and how beautiful she was, named her the Princess Moon, because surely she was the Moon King's daughter. Well, things like this continued for some years, and the family was so enamored with the little girl that they actually put her behind screens as though she were an actual princess, and they put her the most beautiful kimonos and yukos. They did everything to please them. And then they wouldn't even let the servants wait upon their daughter. They waited upon her personally because they didn't want anyone else seeing her beauty. In spite of this, though, news of her beauty got out. People heard about it, and suitors would come from every province you could think of to try to win the maiden's hand. She wouldn't see any of them, though. They weren't even allowed to see the servants of the house. None of them were. But some of them were a little bit more persistent than others. They would actually stand outside the fence, and some of them drilled holes into the fence to be able to look through and see her a little bit better when they could. However, the girls still continued to refuse to see anyone. Well, eventually, many of them lost heart and they left, but there were 5 who were more persistent than the rest. They were not going to give up. So, these 5 knights stayed through all weather. They stayed through the winter whenever it was so cold and sleet and the snow, and they nearly froze to death. They refused most meals unless their servants brought them food because they were afraid that if they walked away for just one moment while they were looking through these chinks in the wall, they would not be able to see her walking from room to room. She was just so gorgeous. But she still refused to see them. They continued on through the winter into the spring, so much so, in fact, that the girl's father actually began to grow very sad and worrisome for them. So he went out and he said, "Why do you stay? She will not marry anyone. Go." And they began to implore with the father and said, "Please, make her marry one of us. You're her father. You can tell her what to do." And he began to say, "She's not my daughter. I have raised her as my daughter, but she's not of this world. I don't think that I have a place." But even as he began to say this, the knights continued to beg and implore him, so much so that the man's heart was moved, and he went to his daughter and he said, "I know that you are not necessarily my daughter, but have you not enjoyed my house? Have you not enjoyed the love that we have given you for all these years?" And she answered as a dutiful daughter and said, "I regard you as my own father, and there's nothing you could not ask that I would not do." Well, the man was very pleased with this, and he began to approach her with the idea of marriage, and she refused. She didn't want to marry. And the man said, "It's all good that you should remain alone while I'm alive, but once I'm gone, who will take care of you? How will you go through?" Well, the girl was very sad, and she agreed to marry. However, she knew that these knights had only stayed because of her beauty, and she worried that she was not as beautiful as reported, and they might be disappointed, and whenever they were, they might leave. So she asked her father if perhaps these knights could prove themselves by completing tasks. Well, the man thought this was very reasonable, and he agreed. But the 5 tasks she picked were a little bit different. From the first night, she asked that he get the stone bowl of Buddha, which was in India. From the second, she asked that he get a branch from the beautiful tree on top of Mount Horai. Now, this tree was very special. It had silver roots, a golden trunk, and it bore fruit of diamonds. However, some worried that it wasn't even real. From the third, she asked that he get the pelt of a fire rat from China. From the fourth, a stone from the top of a dragon's head that was said to shine in 5 different colors. And then from the fifth, she asked that he get a shell from a swallow's stomach and then bring her the shell. Well, the man was very worried. These were all very impossible tasks, and he worried that the knights might be very upset when he went to talk to them. But this is what his daughter wanted, and he figured that she knew best. So going to them, he said, "My daughter's very special. She's not of this world, and if you wish to marry her, these are the tasks you must complete." And he told each knight what his task was, and all of them were very upset. These were impossible tasks. No woman was worth this, so they all went home. But as they were home, they began to think of the princess and how beautiful and lovely she was and how wonderful wife she would make. Plus, her dad was very wealthy. Yeah, you're a gold digger back there, I can see. So, each of them decided they would try to complete the task. So the first knight sent word to the princess that he would go about trying to do this, but in these days, you must remember that travel was very dangerous and there was no guarantee that you would live through it. So the knight decided that rather than going to India to get the true bowl of Buddha, he would go instead to try to get one from a Buddhist shrine. So he went up to the shrine, he gave them the money, and said, "Please give me your bowl." So he traded them a large sack of money in exchange for a bowl, quite a good exchange on the part of them. And he took it home and he waited for 3 years. He figured 3 years was surely enough time for her to think that he had gone to India and come back. Well, after 3 years had passed, he went to the house. He had the bowl in a beautiful box, and he presented it to his father and said, "Here's my gift to the princess. I have completed my task as promised." Well, the father was very happy. He was sure that he was looking at his future son-in-law. So he took the bowl to the princess, and at first she was scared. She didn't want to get married. That's why she had created these tasks. As she opened the box and put the fabric to the side and she saw the bowl, though, she was relieved. She saw that it did not shine, therefore it was not the true bowl. So she sent it back to her father, who approached the man, and he was sent away in shame. The second knight was no more entrepreneuring than the first. I mean, he was quite lazy. He didn't want to deal with it. So what he did, instead of trying to seek out Mount Rai, which everyone had assured him was not real at all, he commissioned a group of artisan craftsmen. So what he did was he had a group of 6 servants go with him to a little island where they built a beautiful place. But there were no windows in his house. Now, once the servants were sent away, he had the craftsmen come, and together they all worked to create a branch that looked like it had to come from Mount Rai. It was a beautiful silver branch, and it had beautiful things on the end. And the fruits were gorgeous. Diamonds the like you have never seen. And they continued to work like this for some time. And once it was complete, the man didn't even look at it. He merely ordered it boxed up, and then he went off to the princess without a moment's delay. And as he arrived, he was a little bit smarter than the first. He arrived looking terrible. He had his clothes torn and tattered, he rolled in the dirt, and he was covered in water. And whenever he actually showed up, the father said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "I was so excited to bring this to the princess. I didn't wait at all. Please, I've just arrived from my travel. Please present this to the princess." And the father was very pleased. Once again, he thought this was going to be his son-in-law. So he took the princess, and when she opened it, she was scared. She thought surely this couldn't be the actual limb from the tree. But she sent her father to find out for sure. And as her father was talking to the man, he made absolutely no qualms in trying to lie to him. He began to tell him about how he had fought his way there, and how while there he had actually had to trick the demons in order to allow him to take the branch. And he continued on and on, but even as the man was telling his story, the craftsmen that he had hired showed up demanding to be paid. The man had never paid them. And the princess was so pleased to hear this story that she paid each and every one of the men personally. And then she ordered the tree branch taken away. Now the knight was very upset by this, because not only had he been shamed and he'd lost the chance for this, but it had all been someone else's fault. So he actually beat the craftsmen until they were nearly dead. Thankfully, he left their money. The fourth one was no better, and the third one was no better than the rest. Rather than going to China to try to get the pelt of a fire rat, excuse me, I'm talking a lot. Rather than trying to go to China himself to try to get that, what he did was he called his friend. He sent a letter to his friend in China. He'd been there for some time anyway, and he figured his friend would surely know where a fire rat was better than himself. Devon, you know better. Now you're right, home, he gave. So he actually sent his friend this letter asking that he bring this back in exchange for a large bag of gold. Well, as this happened, it continued on, and finally the man knew that his friend was going to come back. So